Good evening and welcome to TDM Talk Show. I'm your host, Kelsey Wilhelm. Our guest this evening is Father Peter Stilwell, the former rector of the University of St. Joseph, who retired recently from the institution after over 8 years successfully reshaping and making it what it is today. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I understand that you moved to Macau because of the University of St. Joseph, and then you spent over 8 years here working on the institution and building it up and diversifying it. Can you explain to me, I understand you came back here and you came here first in 2008 to see what it was like, and that led to you coming here. How did that process happen?
Well, Professor Ruben Cabral, who was the previous rector, he invited me to come because he and Father Luis Sequeira had thought of setting up the teaching of theology in the university, in the institute as it was at the time. And I was dean of the Faculty of Theology of the Catholic University of Portugal. And for them to be able to run a successful course in theology, which would grant a degree recognized by the Vatican, and in other words, allow students then to go to other pontifical universities and circulate around the world, that required the Vatican to sign off on the project. And so I went to Rome several times, and I came here in January of 2008, and then I came again in October 2008 for the beginning of the teaching sessions. And then after that I came every year to do 1 month of teaching as a visiting academic. So I was familiar with Professor Ruben and his projects, and I knew that he was very enthused with the idea of setting up a new campus. And I helped him also as being myself vice rector of the Catholic University of Portugal at that stage, when they came to the point of deciding whether they would change the institute into a university. There also they needed the Vatican to say yes and to agree to the name and to agree to the setting up of the project. And I also sort of wrote to Rome and contacted Rome on their behalf, and then got back to them saying that yes, things were okay. Finally, in 2012, there was a critical moment in which the Bishop of Macau contacted my bishop in Lisbon and said we need to have a change in the administration of the university. And my bishop, who's the Patriarch of Lisbon, contacted me and said, well, can you pack your bags and be in Macau in 2 weeks' time? And I said, okay.
In just 2 weeks?
Well, I think it must have been more or less 2 weeks or 3 weeks.
Okay. You know, I find it really interesting because, especially in that period of time, 2008, 2012, Macau has obviously gone through such massive growth within this time period, but it does have a religious history that is embodied by the symbols of Macau, which are all across the city. But specifically that time, attracting youth to study something like theology or study religious studies, and setting up a religious university within Macau, a university that has a religious backing. Did you find that at all to be complicated, or find it hard to find students and let them know also you were teaching not only religious studies but other things?
Well, the Institute began in 1996, 1997, with postgraduate studies, master's and doctoral programs, as an inter-university institute. And it was not specifically centered on religious topics. As I say, it was it wasn't Father João Lourenço who set it up, who thought of that, but it was Professor Ruben Cabral who thought the time had come. He had expanded the institute to take on undergraduate studies. Also, you should put this in the context that higher education in Macau was expanding. It had been non-existent practically for 100 or 200 years, except for the seminary of St. Joseph. And then there was a small university that was set up by some people from Hong Kong, which was called the East Asia University.
Mm-hmm.
And the East Asia University was bought up by the Portuguese administration so as to turn it into the Macau University, IPM, and so on. And more or less at that time, when these institutions were being set up, that was in 92 or 93 or 94, then the Catholic University of Portugal with the Diocese of Macau decided to set up this institution. So it was an institution for, let us say, secular subjects. And when it was expanding in the 2005, 6, 7, 8, it seemed to those in charge that it was the time had come to put some life back into the seminary of St. Joseph, which had been a sort of continuation of the College of St. Paul, which was the first university-style institution in East Asia. But the College of St. Paul, when the Jesuits were suspended, it was handed over first to another religious order and then to the Diocese of Macau. And although it took on many people and taught them subjects which were languages, culture, and so on and so forth, the core objective was formation of priests. And that had disappeared for historical reasons. At a difficult moment here in Macau, when there was a cultural revolution going on in China, the Diocese of Macau decided that it was perhaps safer to send the students from the seminary to different parts of the world. So some were sent to Portugal, some were sent to Hong Kong for formation. And that was, so the seminary ended up between the early 70s and 2008 as being more or less an empty shell.
And then going into 2012 and then what it's become now, there's the new campus, obviously in Ilha Verde. You have already multiple graduating classes which have come out, and you've seen not only the evolution of USJ in and of itself, but higher education within Macau and where things are starting to go in terms of that level. What do you think about how Macau is progressing in terms of higher education? We have very many different types of institutions with different types of funding, different types of ideologies, and different student bases. For example, USJ is also not allowed to have mainland students yet. What do you think about the overall framework of what we're looking at in terms of higher education in Macau?
The institutions arose for different reasons. Some were government-sponsored. In other words, Macau University, IPM, IFT for tourism, and obviously the Security Academy. But then there are private institutions which arose after the handover, which is MUST, City University, and altogether it seemed to be a lot of higher education institutions for a small territory. Just before I came to Macau, Mr. So Shu Fai took over in Gaesh, and he was a man with vision, was and is a man of vision. He had been in DSEJ and had set up the transformation of the non-tertiary education, and he has built up the tertiary education, the framework for the tertiary education, with the new law, which was approved in 2017, if I'm not, and then some added legislation that 2018, and then the requirement that all the higher education institutions adapt their charters to these new regulations. So we all had to hand everything in by August of last year.
Do you think that's going to be good, though? Do you think that's in the long run, or do you think that's going to
lead
to more of a unification, or?
It has brought in certain rules, and it has brought in a requirement which will take time to seep in, which is that we must get external assessment and accreditation. In other words, we have to go to international accrediting agencies to accredit our various programs and eventually get our institutional accreditation. This means that we must reach international standards. Obviously, it'll depend on which of the international accrediting agencies that is chosen, but all of them nowadays are, as you know, higher education was, I say was because we've got the coronavirus, this has changed things, was becoming very internationalized. The qualification of a university was assessed by how many foreign students it managed to bring in and how international its staff was. And these were important criteria. We don't know what the coronavirus is going to do because at the moment traveling, as you know, is difficult.
Yeah.
And many universities are working online. So the panorama may change. But higher education is certainly a big international industry. In Australia, I think it is. It's the second industry as far as bringing in foreign.
Well, and we know where a lot of the students are coming from also.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, it is something that has been worked at over the years, and given that it's the only institution in Macau which is not able to accept Chinese students, are you expecting that, because of the religious nature of the university, are you expecting that new agreements between the Vatican and China or new changes within the relationship is going to then allow for students from China to be able to attend USJ?
I'm hopeful that this will eventually come on as a natural development. I don't know whether the media noticed, but last year, 2019, in October, 2 agreements were signed, one with Portugal and the other with mainland China, for the recognition of all degrees and diplomas granted in Macau. In other words, we are caught in this, not caught, but we are involved in this, in these agreements. So all the degrees provided by USJ are now recognized in Portugal and through Portugal in the Bologna area of the European Union and in mainland China. So
does that include the religious studies major?
That would include the religious studies.
Okay. Okay.
Which is including the Vatican gives it an extra recognition. So eventually these things will pan out as being the logical development. If USJ is seen as providing a good service to the local Macau community and providing courses which are of interest to mainland China. Macau itself is going to be integrated into the Greater Bay Area. There is already an alliance of the Greater Bay Area higher education institutions, of which we are a member. So I think the natural course of things will be that perhaps PhD students first, and then master students, and then whatever.
Okay. Okay. Yes, it does seem like things are evolving. I wanted to ask in terms of your, aside from USJ, in terms of your personal viewpoint on things. Obviously, you are a father. You've decided to dedicate your life to Catholicism and to theology in particular, and teaching and spreading not only the original word but also knowledge in general. But then we have the idea of governance also. We have we're teaching people, let's say, for example, political studies students, we're teaching them to then become the next leaders of the countries or regions that we're in within a religious institution. Or you have a group like the United States, which has supposedly a complete separation of church and state, but then we still have In God We Trust, which is printed on our money. What do you think about that crossover? Is there any type of mixture between religion and governance which is healthy or unhealthy?
It is a relationship which has always existed. In all all political structures that I know of, there's always been this dimension of the religious, if we can use it in a broad sense. I mean, religion is what binds people together through a series of beliefs in values, in objectives, and politicians and the state, when the state began to exist, have always needed to be able to bring people's minds to focus on certain issues. And so they need to work with what actually moves people. It's not enough to have rallies and get people excited. You have to get them on board to do things on a day-to-day basis without having a police looking over their shoulders. So there have to be, they have to internalize a certain number of ethical rules and a way of looking at things, and that is very closely linked to what we understand as a religion. So you could have, if you look at it as I would look at it as an academic, you can see, for example, a Marxist state, for example. There you will find that Marxism has many expressions which are very similar to religious. They have their liturgies, they have their shows and their saints and their, you know, so as to attract the attention of the masses. This is something that has always existed. In let us say, the 18th, 19th century, the idea began to arise that we should separate politics and religion. And there was a violent way of doing it, which was the French Revolution. And there was the soft, which was the United States, in other words, separation. For good reason, because many of the people in the United States had escaped to the United States from religious persecution. So the idea was that we don't want the state interfering in our religious beliefs.
But from my personal point of view, it seems like there could be a bit of a contradiction in terms of the historical background and then also religion now being used as a political divider. You've seen a certain type of speech from the leader of the nation, which is choosing to separate different religious groups and put them into boxes and not bring them together by common values. Is that the type of religion that you have studied?
Well, I've studied that religions are dangerous, and they are also very constructive. They can be very humanizing, but they can also be very dangerous because they become, they can act as a sort of glue that builds up a feeling that those who belong to our group are saved and those who are out are damned, so to speak. And so you've had religious wars, which are terrible and violent, and you've had religious violence throughout history. You've had political violence as well. I think we must always be aware, if we are religious ourselves, and in my case, obviously, always aware that there are these traces of violence in ourselves and in our emotions, in our tension, in our relationships with other people, and that very quickly we can grab hold of things which we think are going to support our point of view, and especially if you can say God is with us, and that is very strong. And you can say, if God is with us, then who are they with?
Well, and what we're seeing right now, we're obviously going through this global pandemic. A lot of people are reaching out for groups that they have in common with. They're taking more to social media because of the fact that they've been quarantined. They're spending time with a smaller group of people because of not being able to be so social. Do you think that is drawing people closer to religion or potentially further away from religion?
I think I've seen on television that many people have been using this time, obviously for doing physical exercise, but also for doing meditation and greater awareness. I myself have made use of this time for some spiritual delving, so to speak. And it is, I'm not quite sure what is going to come out of this period. It has been very interesting seeing that many things are changing. But my look at history tells me that we've got to be wary, because changes come, sometimes they can be positive, but sometimes it can be negative.
Yeah.
You've got to be selective, you've got to have criteria, and you've got to have a positive action. In other words, you have to decide what you want to bring in afterwards. You can't just wait for things to just wash up onto the beaches of history, so to speak. You've got to actually proactively construct a new social and world order. We have come from what was called a globalized world. That globalized world spread the virus very quickly because of the traveling. Are we going to give up on a globalized world? Are we going to use the internet more for our globalization so that we don't have to travel so much?
Or be together so much. That is one key part of faith. At least within Catholicism, it is gathering together and having the ritual. As we see evidence, even more so within recent years in Macau, the processions and the rituals. But much like USJ had to turn and take all of its courses online in order to be able to help the people who are a part of its institution, it seems like the various religions of the world within their own way have also taken to the same thing. They've taken to doing more things online. They've taken to having a decentralized approach towards things, and people also being able to engage in faith in their own way. By looking at the Vatican as an institution, as a city-state in and of itself, by looking at every single church which is around the world, which is a congregational place and represents that so much of what the religion is to those people, or at least their social interaction. Do you think that by having this huge shift in us not being able to gather, not being able to worship in those places of worship, that they might not hold as much value, and that people might start to practice a different type of, or people will continue to worship but not necessarily within the same house?
Very possibly. Let's say if we go back to the early Christian expansion, people met in their family houses, and so what we would call a church gathering would be a dozen or 20 people gathering in a room somewhere to have a meal or to listen to an apostle or someone who's passing by, and then to celebrate the Eucharist. Now I've seen from my brothers and sisters and from friends and relations that some have been following the Mass at their local parish online, others have followed the Pope's Mass. So there are new connections. People are discovering that there are more interesting masses than the ones they used to go to, because the priest in their parish perhaps wasn't the best preacher, and so they are able to pick up on better types of faith services. What is going to happen? We will wait and see. But I think the church has to be flexible, yes.
It seems like it, and there have been different attitudes which have been adopted. Obviously, the most recent Pope has done many things which have not made certain people happy and have made other people happy, and I guess only time will tell. We have seen that has been the history of various popes throughout time, and various leaders.
Yes. Well, if you do anything, someone is going to be happy and someone unhappy.
That's true, including you yourself, right? Coming back to Macau, I know that you had mentioned that Catholics in Macau are less than 3% of the population, but 45% of non-university institutions. Does that necessarily mean that people, when they're going through their primary school education, secondary school education, that they're somehow having a religious influence, or is that only because of the institution historically being religious or having religious links?
Well, the Church has a long tradition of setting up educational institutions. It is seen as one of the spiritual works of mercy, to teach those who need to learn. So you'll find the missions of the church all over the world, and the various churches. They all tend to develop sometimes just Sunday schools, but often they go beyond that. You can think of England at the time of the Industrial Revolution. It was very much the religious movements that started from Sunday schools to things like alphabetization, teaching people to study and so on. And the great universities in Western Europe, they were set up by the church.
Yeah.
Why were they set up by the church? Was it to bring people into the fold? I don't think so. I think possibly sometimes that was the objective. But the dynamic which I feel is the closest to the spirit of a Catholic university is what Pope John Paul II said was the Gaudium Veritatis, the joy of finding the truth, looking for the truth. And so if we can provide to people this joy of looking for the truth, this is something that is what we would call pre-evangelization. It is if people are looking for the truth, they are on the right way, so to speak. And eventually they will get to deeper levels of understanding of what it is to be a human being, how it is to organize life in the community, and that is the service that we can provide.
What happens when those ideas confront historical traditions? We've seen that the church has been more flexible recently, but for example, looking at some of the things which are taught at exactly the University of St. Joseph, there's some of the things that it would be impossible to think that they could be taught at that university 100, 200 years ago. Some of the more progressive ideas which have come up, some of the scientific ideas which have come about. Where is that? Is there any point at which that flexibility should stop in order to preserve tradition?
Well, tradition is something that doesn't have to do with what we did yesterday. Tradition is within our Catholic tradition is that experience of interacting with Jesus that the apostles had, which was to discover their human dignity, to discover the dignity of all those around them, to discover that we are all brothers and sisters in God. This was a joy that was in the heart of the apostles, and they handed on to other people. This is a living tradition, which then dresses in different ways, in different places, and different liturgies, but it is this living, like in a family. Each family has its own tradition, which the way people deal with one another, brothers and sisters, and parents, and it passes on from generation to generation. Some people, when I answered the phone, thought I was my father because we spoke in a very similar way. These are sort of things which handed on spontaneously. That is the living tradition. Whether we are studying science, if you go back in history, there's a sort of narrative that comes from the 18th century, which says that Catholicism persecuted science. But if you actually go back, you see that many of the great scientists were religious people,
yes.
monks, priests, and
prone to reflection, time to think about things.
Even Galileo, who's always brought up, was a good Catholic. The fact that the Pope was also thought he was an astronomer and had a different idea put him at loggerheads with the Pope. But obviously, Galileo was right.
True. History has told us. It seems like, there's a lot of people who say that history is written by those who won, but we don't always know because we weren't there and we can't see it.
That's true. I teach that to my students, that it's always orthodoxy always wins because the group that wins always considers themselves to be orthodox. Orthodox not in the sense of the Orthodox section of the.
But we are the correct ones. We are the
correct
ones who are the correct
ones
upholders of the faith.
Yeah, that is always the temptation. And the big challenge for us is to keep our minds open and to keep our hearts open to discover ever more deeply what this world is about that we're in, and what our relationships with other people are. If we actually go in there, we go deeper and deeper, and we find that there is a depth to humanity which often escapes us. We often live just on the surface of our emotions and our tensions, but when we meet the great spiritual masters in many religions, but I speak from my knowledge of, you meet Teresa of Avila or John of the Cross, and you understand that the depth of the human spirit is something that is amazing, and it's a lifelong exploration.
Well, you've spent so many years teaching, you've spent so many years in Macau also helping develop this into what it is. Stepping back from it and finally having time to yourself, what do you think that you're going to want to do?
I would like to write some of the things that I've been teaching to my students, and I've got notes. My students would have liked me to give them something more than just notes, but I could point them to some books for them to read. But I would like to put together some of the ideas which I don't think have been said already by some of the books that I have pointed out. Okay. I would like to try and see if they can be put on paper.
All right. Well, we look forward definitely to reading those books when you choose to share them with us. Unfortunately, our time is drawn to a close. Thank you so much for being on the show and for your dedications to Macau.
Thank you for having me.
That's all for tonight. Thank you for watching. We'll be on a short break over the summer, but be sure to tune in again soon for more TDM Talk Show. Good night.